All right. Hi, Abby. Hi, Fennet. Good to see you again. And hello, everyone. Sorry for the delay. We're just zooming in, so it doesn't look like Putin at the end of the table speaking to you. I hope you can see us now. All right. Thank you so much. Yeah, it's my pleasure to welcome everyone to the online launch of the study. And as actually in my former capacity as deputy head of division SO3, stabilization peace building, I have the pleasure to provide some short opening remarks to this launch. Perhaps to provide you with a little bit of background of the study and the overall project. It's essentially part of a larger endeavor, collaboration between GPPi and the Federal Foreign Office called Stabilization Lab, where we look at those tricky questions and issues that come across peace builders and stabilization experts when doing their work. And one of these questions is actually elections, or let's say contested elections, and the threats emanating from the digital sphere, which is not new as a phenomenon, but in terms of understanding the phenomenon a bit more, unpacking it and providing recommendations, that's rather new. And that's essentially what the study is aiming to do, to understand the problem a bit better with a focus on Africa, but then also provide best practices for which we can then take forward. So what went into the study, a number of workshops and conversations between practitioners and experts, extensive research, of course, by the GPPi team, and then they brought it all together in the study. So if there are any colleagues and experts on the call who also participated in the workshops, this is the moment to thank you also for your contributions, which have enriched the study immensely. So perhaps to also take on my new hat at the Division 607. For those who do not know, the division looks at disinformation in a more general way, beyond elections and beyond the peace-building realm. Disinformation as a threat to, well, basically to peace and stability, but also to democracy, to our own democracy, but also political processes abroad and political participation. So also from that perspective, the study is extremely valuable because it provides those hands-on recommendations that we can all take forward. So without further ado, and a big thank you to GPPi, to Abi, to Fennet for their tremendous work. I look forward to hearing about the study a bit more.
Thank you very much, Sophia. So hopefully you can now see a PowerPoint presentation. If that changes at any point, do let me know. So thank you very much. So since the start of last year, Fennet and I have been seeking to understand how donors and implementers develop effective strategies to mitigate key digital threats to the integrity of and violence surrounding elections in Africa. By this, we have not looked just at mis and disinformation, but also internet shutdowns, surveillance and tracking of human rights defenders, and cyber laws and penalties.
And so, yeah, welcome from me as well. And as Abby has said, and as Sophia has also talked to, our team has spent the last year interviewing, running workshops, and undertaking foresight scenario exercises, and in total engaging with over 100 experts and practitioners from African civil society organizations, donor states, international organizations, to understand what lessons exist when it comes to tackling digital threats to elections on the African continent. And what emerged are 4 building blocks for success, which seem to be present in more successful programming. And these are what we discuss in our report, which was launched today. The link is in the chat, but on the next page or on the next slide, you'll also find a QR code if you would like, I don't know, to shortly take a picture or shortly scan the link, but also we'll send it in the chat shortly. And so these 4 building blocks that we want to focus on are what Abby will show you on the next slide. 4 different beautiful icons that our design person has created. The first one looks at understanding the digital threat landscape. The second one looks at varied actors for varied digital threats. The third building block is called taking an institutional approach to digital threats. And in the last one, we look at hybrid solutions for hybrid problems. This might sound a little bit cryptical, but we'll get to it in a bit. In the report, we structured each building block around 3 potential levels of investment. And rather than a comment on the quality of programming, this leveling attempts to recognize that the pot of money for such activities is not infinite. So instead of setting too many overly ambitious objectives that end up collecting dust in a cupboard, it examines what organizations have been able to do, as well as what they could potentially achieve with varying levels of investment, from high in amount of time and funding allocated to medium and low. One important thing to note is that while the report focuses on programming, a common thread which ran throughout our interviews and the workshop was the importance of combining good programming at a programming level with strategic level buy-in from donors and governments. Strategic buy-in has, in our understanding, a significant impact in, for instance, improving the amount and the consistency of funding, and as well as the behavior of key political actors around elections who may suddenly feel kind of the eye of the international community on them, holding them accountable. Therefore, rather than a building block in itself, we noted this as an enabling factor for everything else. We will now take each of these building blocks in turn, explaining kind of the levels of investment and provide some examples that we've also mentioned in the report. And I'll hand over to you, Abby.
Okay, thank you very much. So first, I will talk about the first building block. So understanding the digital threat landscape. So digital threats do not impact all elections or all citizens equally. Understanding the key problems in different contexts and understanding how different people will be impacted is essential. So at the highest level of investment, in an ideal case, there would be a baseline assessment of key risks and differentiated vulnerability before programming has started, continual learning throughout programming, and then an assessment of what has been achieved at the end of programming. Some organizations we spoke to did do this to varying levels of success. So for instance, we found that BBC Media Action develops baseline surveys to assess the most important topics for communities, and then uses content analysis to see whether the quality of reporting has changed on those particular topics. At a medium level of investment, when organizations do not have time to do baseline surveys, they need to learn on the job. But then there needs to be a recognition that that's what we need to do. And there needs to be funding and time set aside to allow that to happen. We can't just assume that small organizations can sort of do this on the side. And this was pretty successful in, for instance, the MPEMA consortium, which was a consortium focused on hate speech during the 2022 Kenyan elections. They were convened by UNDP and focused on developing who to target and the most important problems using social listening and tracking of hate speech, and then adapted programming based on what they were learning. And then at the lowest end of investments, we have to at least ask after programming has happened whether anything worked, which feels like a wasted resource if we don't do it, but it is still sadly quite rare. In this regard, we were impressed by UNDP's own assessment of its iVerify tool, which was frank and clearly noted areas to improve.
And now on to the next building block, which is on varied actors for varied digital threats. And here, despite kind of the multifaceted nature of digital threats to elections, there are few incentives to pool resources or even coordinate activities in the same area, which can make efforts less effective than they could be and leads to a lot of duplication. More successful efforts have brought together a variety of stakeholders to develop multi-pronged solutions. And so at a high investment, donors should invest in coalition building so organizations have the resources to come together to come up with coordinated responses, including a pooling of resources or designing complementary interventions. This again has been done to varying levels of success, from the Mapema Coalition, which Ami just mentioned, which built dashboards and situation rooms to effectively coordinate a whole host of actors, both offline and online, which included fact checkers, communicators, local, national, international organizations, as well as, for example, another case, iVerify, who, as Abi said, reflecting on its earlier kind of difficulties to get local buy-in, emphasized teaming up with local radio stations in later iterations. And even if it's not possible to establish coalitions, the nature of digital threats still necessitates more coordination between states, CSOs, and international organizations. On strategic issues, this is already happening, and we see this, for example, in the Freedom Online Coalition. And on a working level, there have been efforts as well from organizations like Access Now, which many of you may know, and the International Fact-Checking Network, to build lessons learning opportunities and processes between members. And lastly, on a lower investment allocated, several organizations have facilitated networking and learning opportunities to improve collaboration on a smaller budget. And this ranged from continental conferences like Africa Checks does, or helping build quite physical co-working spaces for media-related organizations like Bazara Media in Nairobi. I think your microphone's still off, Abi.
Thanks very much, Fen. And so the third building block for success is taking an institutional approach to digital threats. So too often, programming aimed at mitigating digital threats focuses on small programmatic activity instead of investing in institutions on the front line of these risks who struggle with sporadic and often short-term funding. This type of funding can not only be ineffective, but can sometimes be counterproductive when ably trained staff then take their skills elsewhere or lack the ability to absorb them within the institutions that they then go back to join. So instead, better than training a few individuals is to focus on organizational gaps. So at the higher level of investment, ideally, project partners that are trusted in the community can be identified early on so that initial development of programming can be based on actual need. This is still very much a work in progress. And for instance, the best example that we found was during the 2022 Kenya elections, where USAID worked with 100% local organizations, and interviewees recognized how good having established networks was for sort of hitting the ground running. At the medium level of investment, when training does happen, it's better to focus that training on organizations rather than a few individuals who may leave when the skills improve, or as I said, may be unable to use those skills within an unchanged organization. So a few organizations adapted their approach, learning from past sort of failures. So, for instance, Digital Defenders Partnership and BBC Media Action adapted their model to embed trainers within organisations, sometimes for 3 to 6 months, but in other times quite a lot longer, to address organisational gaps. At the lowest end of investment, even if there's only a small amount of funding, it might be more useful to aim that funding at core capacity gaps rather than delivering another project. So, for instance, USAID, when they developed this 100% funding for local organisations within the 2022 Kenya elections, they tried to carry the burden of some of the core capacity gaps, for instance, around monitoring, evaluation and learning. And other donors tried to develop core funding streams rather than another project.
And lastly, let's move to the last building block called hybrid solutions for hybrid problems. And to me, or in interviews that we've heard, we often heard that there has been a tendency among international donors to prefer more attractive or flashy high-tech solutions to digital threats to elections, when these may not be the most useful solution, especially in areas where internet penetration is low and the needs of civil society organizations could, for example, be basic connectivity issues. Instead, decisions on whether to use a tech fix, as we call it, should be based on need, capacity, and whether there are potentially any more low-tech solutions. On high investment, funders and their project partners have worked together with local experts to identify the specific problem technology can, in fact, solve. And so that it works towards actual need. This was, for example, the focus in the work of Full Fact and others who are in a research phase of a project examining how artificial intelligence could transform or enhance the work of fact checkers. If such an assessment of the specific tech need is not possible, donors can at least assess the capacity, or should at least assess the capacity of communities and CSOs to use the tech or tech-based trainings being provided. Both the Digital Defenders Partnership, which we've already mentioned, and CPPi include designated time for an organizational assessment of existing skills and capacities in their programs for enhancing organizational digital security and resilience. And lastly, on a lower level of investment, implementers and donors alike must also consider that the best use of funding in an area may also be a tried and tested low-tech solution. So for instance, Media Focus on Africa Uganda, Deutsche Welle Akademie, and Human Rights Network for Journalists have all found in-person approaches often proven more useful in addressing the dangers of, for example, mis and disinformation, hate speech, or fostering media literacy. Yeah, that is the last building block. So I'll hand it over to you, Abi, to introduce our next speaker.
Thank you very much. So just a quick reminder, before I turn to Fortune, the question and answer box is still very much open. So feel free to start adding any questions you have now, and also feel free to use the comment box in case there's something else that you want to add, which isn't a question. So now I will turn over to Fortune to reflect on her own work in this space and the relevance of her own building blocks.
Thank you very much. So I think I want to start off by providing some context on the current state of democracy to help highlight the importance of these findings that has just been shared by Abi and Fennet. So we know that democracies are on the decline, right? That if you look at the democracy reports by Variety of Democracy, that's BDEM, for the past 5 years, the key message is that democracies are on the decline, and linked to that is the decline in the fading, decline in free and fair elections. So in other words, elections are getting worse globally. If you look at within sub-Saharan African region, according to the report, that's the 2023 report, democracy is now at the level equivalent to those that we had 2 decades ago. So with the resurgence of coup d'etat in the region is really struggling with unconstitutional transfer of power. This implies that the region and the world as a whole are experiencing an increase in autocracies. Then simultaneously, we are seeing this rise in digitalization, which has two sides. So we have the one side, which is it facilitates the dissemination and exchange of political information and discourses, right? But on the other, that is particularly during elections. But on the other hand, we are seeing the rise in the spread of disinformation. We are also seeing that in some country, digitalization has become a tool for repression. So when you look at censorship of social media and internet shutdown. Existing data, for instance, has shown that countries that have autocratized have also worsened on the scores on disinformation frequencies, which brings me now back to the report, the findings that has been shared, to underscore the importance, noting that if efforts to address the current decline in democracies are to work, they must also effectively target digital threats to elections. Now, let me go to reflecting on these building blocks, looking at the building blocks that has been shared, reflecting on my work, some of my works, looking at Kenya, Liberia, and then also in the case of Ghana. So on the first building block, that is understanding the digital threat. When I started delving into the topic of digital threat during the 2022 Kenyan elections, I realized, so one thing stood out for me was that there were several interventions ongoing. And this is consistent with findings like the report, aspects of the report highlighted, for instance, that some interventions were uncoordinated and efforts were being duplicated, right? Even if you look at the mission report, you would see that they noted the multiplicity of efforts and the lack of coordination as one of, in tackling disinformation as one of the challenges, and where instances of different organizations debunking the same posts. So uncoordinated interventions also means that while certain areas are receiving more attention from several actors, it leaves gaps in other areas. So studying and understanding the context probably would give you a better appreciation of the needs and the gaps and how to address them. Maybe as a funder, what you could be doing maybe to even help create a non-partisan platform to bring together all relevant actors to map out strategies and even support regular exchanges. That could be something that you do and it will be effective, right? Another point on that is from my observations during the 2023 Liberian elections, where it is important not to work with flawed assumptions. Again, emphasizing on the importance of understanding the space. So the NEC, which is the National Election Commission, noted that they had to deal with several cyber attacks on their results management system, particularly during the peak of tallying and tabulation process. So it is easy for you to assume that a country like Liberia will not have to deal with such levels of interference. However, if you speak to relevant actors and institutions, you get to understand the political context, which is very, very important, and their needs and how to prepare or anticipate and prepare for such interference. So in the case of Liberia, pre-election assessment mission by ECOWAS and meetings with NEC helped NEC to it's revealed the gaps in the Commission's data management and cybersecurity system. And with support from ECOWAS, the Commission tried to build a safeguard and checks to prevent unauthorized access and interference during with their results management. Now I go to the second building blocks, that is varied actors with varied digital threat, right? For varied digital threat. We know, and as has been said by Fennet and Abi, digital threats are multifaceted, and it requires a mix of legal, policy, programming tools to address them. And it is also important to work with different, and this requires working with different actors, right? Like including the tech platforms and CSOs. And which brings me back to the first point I made on the need to have better coordination system where you coordinate all these interventions. But then again, I would want to highlight the need to look at support to countries or support for in-between elections. Disinformation is not limited to electoral periods alone. What we do see during elections is only an amplified version of what happens in between elections or prior to the elections, right? We look at recent publication by the African Center for Strategic Studies, highlighting a significant rise in disinformation campaigns in Africa. And it noted a fourfold increase documented in 2023 alone. If you dive into the countries, into the cases, you would see that most of these were even happening, that is during 2023, were happening in countries that they were not having elections. The case of Ghana, for instance, is there. If you look into the map, you see the case of Ghana. We have our elections this year now. We're going to have it in December. But in 2023, we had several incidences of disinformation, right? So it is important to note that disinformation is not just an electoral issue, but it's a persistent issue that affects various aspects of governance and public opinion. The surges during electoral period impacts, the impacts can be very damaging. We know on Kenya 2022 shows that it does undermine voter confidence in the electoral process. So some of if you dive into the reports, some of the tools or some of the programming tools that you can find in the report, such as public awareness campaigns, media literacy campaign programs, should be proactively maybe be deployed long before the elections, because it takes time for these messages to catch up with the population. My take on the third building blocks, that is the institutional approach, cannot be overemphasized. This is very important when you're looking at enhancing local ownership and sustainability of interventions, and which both is, of course, is critical for the effectiveness of the measures. And Abi and Fennet already mentioned the work of the UN, the UNDP. Funding, some of the funding that was used was also from PBF, that is the UN Peace Building Fund, and it went to supporting, let's say, the national cohesion, Kenya's National Cohesion and Integration Commission, for instance. In Liberia, I think the USAID support went to Internews. And these supports went to enhance the capacity of local media organizations to ensure, and this even implies that even after the election, these capacities are within these media institutions to carry on the effect of the impact of the interventions. And I want to note here that it's important that when you're providing the support to even national level institutions, they trickle down to community-based organizations, particularly even within the rural areas, which then leads me to my final point, that is my point on the final building blocks, where like maybe not focusing on high-tech solution, maybe a better support, right? So if you look into the report, there's a proposed solution of tackling digital threat by employing techniques aimed at enhancing social cohesion, building trust in media institutions, and public education campaigns. If you take the case of Liberia 2023, going into the election, public trust was very, very low. Meanwhile, the media landscape and community radios, which are the main source of information, were highly polarized and politicized. Most radio stations in Liberia are owned by politicians. And if you take people particularly in the rural areas, were depending on these community radios for information. Meanwhile, the editorials and the information that were coming from these people were politicized. From my personal observation, I was based in Lofa. Lofa County is the northwestern county, is in the northwestern part of the country. And radio programs were actually direct transmissions of political programs and discussions which were being held on Facebook and YouTube by polarized political bloggers, right? So if the population in the rural areas are even depending on radio, and you have these programs being directly, you just tune in a radio and it is something that is happening on Facebook, a program that is happening on Facebook that is being directly transmitted. So you realize that, of course, there is that link, and research has also shown that there is a link between online and offline media spaces. I think I want to end here. I want to pause here and we open up for questions.
Thank you very much, Fortune. Yeah, lots of what you said resonated with our findings in the report, as you've already noted, particularly around the connection between offline and online spaces, the dangers of duplication when resources are already very scarce. So yeah, a lot that I agree with, and Fortune also kindly offered to have her notes sent round afterwards in case there was any points from the presentation that you missed. I guess maybe a couple of questions from me just to start off. My first question is, we talk a lot about the programs that international organizations can develop, but I'm interested internally what you think about the sort of legal and policy frameworks within some of these contexts where programming is taking place. So what systems do you see lacking and what areas do you see for improvement? Oh,
you're muted.
Yeah, good. Now, if you look at existing data on the legal approach to addressing disinformation, there's data that shows that most countries, and I think I was noting it somewhere, where you see there's a database in the reports. I think, let me try and get that link, the database, the name of the database. I think if you go into the reports, Abi and Fennet has provided that. So the Lexota, is it a Lexota? Right. You would see that out of the 44 countries that data was provided on, it's only 3 that have the legal framework to address disinformation, which means that there is a lot of gap over there when it comes to providing the proper legal framework for some of these interventions. But the programming cannot happen, it cannot be so effective, or in terms of the impact cannot be sustained if we don't have the proper legal framework to support it. So there's a need for support in that area. But 2 things for me that stands out when it comes to the legal framework. We're looking at, if you're providing support to developing the proper legal tools or instruments, the support should ensure that you don't, they are aligned with the strategies and implementations of, of international human rights standards, right? Where particularly the freedom of expression, the freedom of opinion expression is not undermined. That is to say, interventions are to counter hate speech or disinformation should support more speech and not less, right? That is one thing for me. Number 2, I think, and if you work on Africa, I hate generalized statements actually, but here I'm going to generalize because I have worked on some country level, but also continental level works. We are very good at having all the policies, all the legal frameworks, right? We're very, very good at developing these frameworks to meet even international standard. But when it comes to the implementation, that is always our challenge. So if you're providing support to that area should not only end at developing the legal and policy framework, but should also go to supporting the implementation of these policies and legal framework. I think these are my take when it comes to data. What happened? Oh.
Thank you very much. So we've just had a question come into the chat from Holly Ruthrauf, who says, what is the appreciate role for technology companies in the programming you researched? Are there recommendations for the platforms in this process? So I think I'll turn first to Fortune, if that's okay, and then yeah, I'm sure I have a few thoughts, but I'm sure Fennet does as well.
There was a bit of break. The question again.
So the question is, what is the appropriate role for technology companies in programming you researched? Are there recommendations for the platforms in this process?
I think so with what I saw when I was working on the case of Kenya, there is the important, like, you can't leave them out of the programming, right? Because most of these messages or disinformation campaigns are carried through their platforms and they have access, right? So I think, first of all, collaborating with them to be able to detect these messages ahead of time. But one thing that has, and I think I experienced in the case of Kenya, yes, but also even in Liberia, this is what happened. We have the use of local languages, right? So people, they realize that, okay, the algorithm is going to pick the word if it's negative, if it's hate speech, they would pick it up. So what were they doing? They were now using their local languages, which implies that it was very difficult for the algorithm to pick it up. So I think in collaborating with them, one key thing is working with local people, like in terms of the lexicon, the language, to build that into the system, where not only building it into the system, but we also have people constantly within those ethnic groups or dialects picking out, monitoring the platforms and picking out these hate speech. I can give an example, very interesting example that happened in Lofa. So there was a radio program where the program, the person managing the station thought, okay, a candidate in the election was coming. He didn't mean anything. He didn't think that anything wrong would happen. So apparently, the opponent had used their radio station, and I told you radio stations are owned by politicians, use their radio station to spew hate speech. Then they came to take this radio station and they started speaking, using hate speech, and they're saying it in the local language. So he started getting a lot of calls. The manager started getting a lot of calls. And he said, why are you allowing this to happen? He didn't know. He didn't understand the language. So he came in, stopped it. And then fortunately, they had done a recording. So then they played a recording. And he said, then he had someone translating to him, and he was able to fish out some of these things. So that was when we had an interview with him, that was one of the real case of using local languages under the guise of, campaigning or whatever to spew hate speech.
Thank you very much. That's really helpful. Fennet, do you want to reflect, because we did also speak about tech companies in the report, but I'll let Fennet speak to it.
Yeah, sure. Yes, we did speak about tech companies in the report, and specifically about something that we noticed throughout interviews, that in a lot of conversations we had, organizations mentioned that they had talked to tech companies, and in fact to all of the major tech companies, but that it was always single organizations speaking with tech companies. And so almost as if to create the kind of the semblance of actually talking to a lot of people and to be invested and engaged in fostering change, but really minimizing the impact, because there were so many disparate efforts of talking to tech companies and very little kind of leverage to actually push for change. And so kind of something we did mention a little bit in the report was where we did see some kind of trying of coalition building and solidarity mechanisms when it comes to translating some of the kind of wins and gains of European legislation in the past years to the African context, and that there have been some efforts, for example, by fact checkers to kind of try to push for kind of the gains that have been won in Europe and platform regulation on the African continent as well. But to be fair, like we, and even in the coalitions that are trying to push for change, like the Global Tech Coalition for Tech Justice, we still, we felt like in a lot of conversations there was more frustration than feelings of wins in kind of engaging with tech companies. But yeah, definitely, as Fortuna said, there would be a big place for them to be engaged, and even a big place for kind of donors and political organizations and governments in the global north, for example, to push for more change when they are being heard a lot more.
Thanks very much. Yeah, I completely agree with everything that you've just said, and especially this mention of like the like duality of tech companies, that they both have to be part of the solution, but we also have to acknowledge that at the moment they're a big part of the problem. So there's still no questions in the chat. We've got about 10 minutes left, just over. So please do add any more questions, else they will not get answered. In the meantime, I have a couple more questions myself. So I think, like me and Fennet especially, we've got to the end of the report, and in many areas I feel like we have more questions than we have answers around what you do in sort of, oh, Fortune's just dropped off. In how you both overcome this research space, but also how you overcome this programming space. I'm interested to turn to you, Fortune, as our expert. I hope you're still on the line, otherwise I might be turning to Bennett. I'm interested, there's some gaps in understanding. One that I think of is how we navigate this offline online space and understanding how to bridge the gap between them. But then also I want to hear if there's what questions you have that have come from the research that you think need resolving before we can find effective solutions to some of these issues. Fortune, it looks like you are online. Are you able to jump in?
Yes, I just reconnected. Sorry. I think it's what is clear to me is, from my work so far, is there is a need for more research on the topic. And support in that area would be very helpful, where we can understand, of course, the study that we know so far about the gaps that we keep referencing to was one work that was done, I think, on Ghana and I think one or two other countries. So you realize that we still need more studies, research to understand the corridors, the pathways for that between offline and online, right? We need more understanding to better understand it. But again, I think one other area which for me is also understanding the real impact. So I had this challenge when I was working on the Kenyan case, where we talk about the impact of disinformation. We talk about it on the electoral process. We talk about it on impacting voter confidence, right? But again, even on the issue of how does it affect turnout? Do we have, and when I was working on that, one thing that I really would have loved to do would have been to speak to people, to speak to voters, to speak to electorates, to understand, okay, you got this and that information. How did it even impact on your decision to turn out to vote in the first place? Did it impact on the decision as to who to vote for? In which ways did this kind of reduce your confidence in the electoral process, or even in the democratic process, in democracy as a whole? We need more studies in these areas, and I think these studies need to speak to the people at the end, the receiving end of these disinformation campaigns. We need to speak to the people. We need to speak to even the actors themselves that are involved. I think one other area, which is where I started, even that is what triggered my interest in the topic in the first place, is the impact on female politicians. I mean, it has huge implications, right? We know that in the first place already, when it comes to the gender gap in political participation, a lot has been done, but we still lag behind. In a lot of countries, even on the continent, that when it comes to women, the full and equal participation of women, it is already low. Then here is a tool. And when I started researching on this, actually, social media could be a tool to facilitate women political participation. In which ways? First of all, if you have, and we know that from gender norms or societal norms, we know that the duty of care is on women, right? The duty, then even the biological, so they have kids and things like that. So if you have a social media, if you're able to use the social media to reach your constituents, that would be the most easiest way to connect with your constituents, right? So it is a positive tool. But unfortunately, from experiences from my knowledge of what happened in Kenya, from my knowledge from what happened in Liberia, this has become a tool that has been used to even intimidate women further. So these are the areas, the impact, the true impact, speaking to voters, speaking to them on how it's impacted on their behavior, their decision on turnouts, their confidence in the electoral and democratic processes, and even women political participation are areas that we still need to delve more into, because there are so many questions there that we haven't really having a good answer to.
Yeah, I just wanted to kind of add to that question that you were also mentioning, Abby, because I, even though, of course, as a researcher, I always love to see more research out there, I think it's still important to kind of see how much has already been done and to recognize that more research without kind of putting the research to use isn't actually kind of helpful, and that we all already see so many examples of, as you mentioned, Fortune, kind of people that have looked into the gendered implication of how kind of surveillance, harassment, but also gendered mis and disinformation act. And so I think there, instead of kind of more, I mean, there's always kind of the need for more research, but I think a useful use of kind of resources would also be to look at, okay, how can we, what are helpful approaches to actually tackling this? How can we best support, for example, human rights defenders, election observation personnel, which, as some reports have shown, are also often kind of on the receiving end of a lot of violence in that sense, and also understand, and I think that's also important because it's often an argument for why a lot of people say, it's actually not that impactful to look at digital threats in societies where the internet penetration is low, and maybe then it's not that big of a deal. I think this is also something you spoke to, Fortune, and to the question you mentioned, Abby, that there are some interesting examples, for example, in Ghana, but also in other places, of how actually impactful kind of the in-between conversations on the market, on the streets, or in households or WhatsApp groups are, even if people aren't maybe super active online. And so I think there's some understanding of this. It needs more translating this into actual practice, I think. But yeah, maybe Abby, if you have some concluding questions or thoughts, unless someone wants to has a burning question under their fingers.
Yeah, thanks very much, Fennet. And I completely agree. I think that was also one of the reasons why at the end of the report, we wanted to flag like a selection of the like sort of databases, online games, like networks that already exist within the like the national, international, and continent-wide space, who are already doing like amazing programming and research. And we thought that it made sense not to just produce another report, but also flag that this is building on a lot of work that has already gone before. With the 4 minutes that we have left, I'd like to turn to Fortune and Fennet, if we have time, to reflect on how optimistic you are about the current state of digital threats and our ability to mitigate them. From my own point of view, it felt like the organizations that we spoke to were incredibly inspiring because they were achieving anything against the odds. They're working in times of like huge funding cuts and an inability to really do much at all against, for instance, authoritarian states, which have a big interest in trying to allow some digital threats within their context, and even incumbent regimes who use them to try and stay in power when free and fair elections would see them ousted. So I guess for the 3 minutes we have left, I'd love to turn to you, Fortune, and then you, Fennet, to see how optimistic you are and if anything makes you hopeful.
Yes. So I think for me, I'm very optimistic. The fact that there is so much interest in the topic, the fact that even for countries that you would not think that, oh, the level of internet penetration is low, but then when it getting into elections, relevant stakeholders have started flagging out some of these points or challenges on disinformation. For me, it's the thing in the right direction, right? That we have it under our radar, that we are not sleeping over it. We are working. Some works and interventions are already going on, and again, I'm hopeful that all the findings from your reports and other interventions that are going on are going to help better shape interventions going into the future. Thank you.
Yeah, I think I have a bit of a mixed outlook on the future, both out of kind of I definitely see with concern a lot of crackdowns that are happening, kind of how the number of internet shutdowns, but also the intensity of them and how harshly people are being sanctioned on social media platforms for kind of voicing their political opinions in a lot of contexts. I definitely look at that with a lot of concern because I think that makes political organizing and work to counter a lot of digital threats really difficult. But at the same time, I'm really hopeful seeing how against the odds, as you said, a lot of organizations and individuals are pushing for change, are making sure that kind of those often most marginalized are being heard or are even being prioritized in their programming, but also how much kind of diplomatic maybe even emphasis is being put on disinformation and kind of digital threats. While I'm always a bit hesitant on whether that's also going to translate into action, I do definitely think there's a place and there's a need for that as well. So a mixed outlook, I'd say, but I think anything else than a mixed outlook after 1.5 years of researching that would maybe be a bit rough. So yeah.
Thank you very much. So with that sort of optimistic ending, I'll leave it there. So I've again posted the link to the report in the chat box, as well as the link to the LinkedIn post. Please do get in touch with any concerns, comments, questions that you didn't want to put in the meeting, but maybe you still have. Yeah, so we look forward to speaking with a few of you who we already have planned separate meetings with about the findings of the report and what it can mean for upcoming elections. And we hope that this is the start of a conversation about this important topic. So thanks again for Fortune and to Sophia and the German Federal Foreign Office and to Fennet. So thank you.
And to Abi. Yeah, have a good rest of your day, everyone. And thank you.